Hey quilters, it's Patty Carey of Patty's Patchwork. Welcome to my sewing space. Tonight we are going to work on block 1 and the various components of it, and I'm going to go step by step through some of the parts of the block where I'm going to try and show you how I accurately piece the border pieces for this block, because that seems to be a little bit of a sticking point for some of you. So I'm going to do my best to explain how I do what I do with the block. So the first unit that we're going to make is this one here, step 3, where we've got our D square and we're sewing 2 E3 triangles to it. And I'm going to sew the upper right E3 triangle to the D, and then I'm going to add the upper left one. It really doesn't matter which one you add, but I'm just going to show you my reasoning behind why I add them the way I do. So we've got our D square and we've got our E3 triangle. Now on this triangle, it's a quarter square triangle, so this long edge is straight of grain and the 2 short edges are bias. They are stretchy. So I can flip my triangle, over, and I can line it up and start sewing. But ideally, I actually want to do it this way. And that is because the D square is straight of grain, and I've got my bias on bottom, bias on bottom. And that we're going to let the feed dogs of our machine, they're going to want to pull that bottom layer. So if we put that bias on top, chances are it could stretch longer and the D square will shrink a little bit more and it may distort things. So it is more helpful if we put the bias on the bottom. Now, and I'm going to sew this seam, and I can see, looking at this, that my 1/4 inch I'm thinking is about here. And you know, after doing a few thousand of these, I am getting to be a decent judge of how much space that is taking up, and that this triangle is taking up more than a 1/4 inch. And I suspect you're also getting really good at that. So let's give this a try. I'm going to pop it in the machine and sew our seam here. Yep, I can see where that ended up. It was definitely beyond the 1/4 inch. And so here's the next one. And align it. I'm going to try and find one where I can't quite get that 1/4 inch. Oh, this one is actually pretty good. It's kind of a 1/4 inch, but it's a little bit small. So I'm going to put it in, and I am just going to pull it ever so slightly so that it is now 3/8 of an inch. Yes, that worked very nicely. And I'm going to do a few more because we do have a few to do. I'm working on the queen size for this. This is the Misty Morning colorway. Now this one I can see is a little bit small. So I'm going to sew this one being a little bit small, and I'm going to show you what happens to that. All right, and I'll do one more because I've got a few to do. So I'm lining up the top square corners there, and even this one's not quite enough, so I'm going to just pull it just a little bit. Pull it there. All right, and slide it out. And I'm going to press my seam toward the green. And I'm going to cut this one out right here, because this is the one that is a little bit short. I don't know if you can see here, but where my seam line went through, there's not that much of a space there. So I'm just going to set this one aside because I think it's a good demo one. Okay, slide my other ones out of the way here. And I'm going to go to zoom out a little bit. My bouncy camera. This is very ad-lib videography tonight because I'm really just working on these blocks. Want to show you and help you work through some of the issues that you might be having. Okay, so with these ones, this is where I had a 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch of triangle. And what you can see is the my background triangle is actually extending beyond the edge of my square by a pretty good distance there. And that's going to allow me, that is the correct placement so that I'm not going to lose the tip of my green triangle in my seam. But on this one here, this is the one where it wasn't quite enough, and you can see that there is very little extra room here. So what happens when we take this one and we're going to sew the next triangle on? So that would be this way. But again, I want my bias on the bottom, and I'm going to zoom in again. There we go. So I've got my bias on the bottom. I'm going to line up the bottom 2 square corners, and where my 2 angled edges are crossing, they are 1/4 of an inch from the right edge of my patches here. So I'm going to put my needle right in that V, and when I do that, my foot, there we go, right there, and this is my 1/4 inch foot, and the foot is actually right along the edges of that those patches, and that's where it should be. It's exactly where I want it to be. So let's line this up and stitch her down. And I'm going to sew a couple more of ones that actually have a little bit of space. So there's my piece. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to sew from this side and line them up. Again, it's lined up so that it's 1/4 of an inch from the right edge where I've got that V. So that's where my needle is going to go. And let's see how it looks. And I'll do one more. This one's lined up at the right spot. And again. Now this one looks like there might be a little bit extra space there. Sometimes I'll just scooch it forward so that it crosses right on the 1/4 inch line, and I might have to pull this a little bit to make it line up. Okay, let's take this out. And we will press our seam towards the green square. D square. So our first one that we did was the one that we didn't really have 3/8 of an inch when we sewed our initial seam, when we added the triangle onto the square. It was a little bit tight. So what I've got, I really like the way that those two patches are lined up across the top. They're not jagged, and they are that way because my sewing line, back to the side, because my sewing line, where that V is exactly 1/4 of an inch from the edge. That's why those two triangles are perfectly lined up along that top edge. If one of them had been pulled a little bit forward, or what tends to happen, what I see happening more often than not, is that this one is a little bit down. Like if I got another one here, if I grab another triangle, we think we're pretty good at judging the 1/4 inch, but sometimes it's just a little bit less. Like this one here versus the real 1/4 inch. So it's a little bit less, and I'll sew this one and we'll see how it looks. I'm going to put it in there. I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam. First of all, I can see that these two aren't lining up on the ends very well. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a nice big gap, and I'm trying to pull my green square to get it to fit, but I know it's not going to fit so well. And pull that out. And we'll finger press our seam. And so can you see how the one is, this triangle on the right is sticking up more than the triangle on the left? And why did that happen? That happened because this triangle was not pulled high enough. I needed to pull it farther up because it is, my seam line is up here, and where that V is to the right of my seam line. It's less than 1/4 of an inch from the right edge, and that's why I'm getting that staggered edge. Okay, so now this one was the one where I'm losing all my pieces here. This one was the one where it was a little bit, I didn't quite have enough space on the first one, so it was not 3/8 of an inch where it lined up. And while it looks quite lovely, nice and straight across the top, when I put my ruler in there and line it up so that the edge of the ruler is exactly along the edge of the fabric, my tip of my, I'm gonna lose just the tip of it because it is in the 1/4 inch seam line. It's in the seam line there, so I'm gonna lose it. I would rather have, I've got a couple other pieces that I've sewn here. Here's one that I sewed. This one, when I line up my edge of my ruler exactly on the edge of my patch, you can see that my 1/4 inch seam line right there, my tip of my D square is actually slightly more than 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and that is okay too, because it's going to float versus getting lost if it is the other way around. So the way to get these two triangles to have a nice continuous edge along that outer edge is by lining up the second triangle so that it crosses the angle, the first triangle, right at the 1/4 inch seam line. Here I've got a D square that I've sewn to my E3 triangle, and when I sewed them, the amount of space I had at the bottom there was not quite enough, and you can see where my seam line is that this tip of the E3 triangle is only extending 1/4 inch beyond the bottom. I haven't got my 3/8 inch like I really need. And when I press my seam towards D, you can see that there really isn't any space of the E triangle extending. I should have some triangle extending way down here, and I don't have that. So what happens when we add our adjacent triangle on? Let's take a look. So we're gonna sew our triangle here. So let's flip her around, and I'm going to line up the bottom square corners, and I can still pretty much sew my 1/4 inch seam. And so why would our first triangle not line up at the right spot? It could be that when I cut that, I was cutting 1/4 square triangles, and maybe my diagonal line, when I held my ruler, it didn't go exactly through the corner. It was slightly off center of the corner when I cut from corner to corner. So there are lots of reasons, or it could be that the square was perhaps the wrong size. So I've got my seam here, and actually when I sewed this, my sewing line is slightly to the right of the V. So that tells me I'm going to have a jagged edge at the top as well. And look, of course we do. So where is the tip of that green square? Well, when we hold our ruler along the top edge of the right triangle, you can see that it is going to, if we took our seam there, we're going to cut off the tip of that square. And that is because when we've sewed this triangle onto the green square, our first seam, the triangle tip did not extend 3/8 beyond the edge of the bottom edge of the square. Now this one here, if I hold the ruler against the left top of the left triangle, I might actually be okay when I sew that seam and use that edge of my patch as my edge instead of using that edge as my patch. I will save the tip of my green square there. So just something I need to think about when I'm sewing this patch. As I sew it, I'm going to line up my underneath patch and with this edge, not with this edge, and I'm going to have to fudge that a little bit when I sew it. All right, so we're ready to sew our units together. I've got a bunch of these E3D units sewn together. So let's work on the shorter side units for our block. I've got my C2 triangle, and I'm going to work left to right through my diagram. Here's my diagram, and so I've got C2. I'm going to add one of the D units, then I'm going to add a C1, then I'm going to add another D unit, then I'm going to add a C2, and we'll end up with something that looks like this. So let's give that a try. All right, so here's my C2 triangle, and I'm going to sew with my the unit I'm adding on top for a few reasons. The one reason is that this seam is coming towards me, so it's not going to inadvertently get pushed the wrong direction, because I want it pressed this way, so I'm going to sew it with that direction. I'm going to line up the two tips. They'll automatically line up, and at the bottom end, where I've got a square meeting an angle, our rule is square meets angle, it lines up 3/8 of an inch from the end, and I've got a nice 3/8 inch triangle there. And if I thought it was a little bit smaller than that, I would just give it a little bit of a pull to encourage it to be 3/8 of an inch. So we'll give this a sew and hold them in place. Okay, take that out, and I can see from where my stitching line went through that it really is about 3/8 of an inch there. Just trim my thread, and I'm going to finger press my seam toward my C2. So I've got my unit here. Now it's time to add a C1. So flip it down, and in this case, I could sew either this way or I could sew this way. It really doesn't matter. I think because I've got this seam and it's going this way, I might sew it from this direction here. So we've got our two different angles to contend with here. We have a square meets angle, so we know that wants to line up 3/8 of an inch. And we're getting pretty good at judging that. And on the opposite end, we've got angle meets angle, and we know they should line up 1/4 of an inch from the edge. And we make them do that. Even if they decide they really don't want to, I know that I want them to. So fit that in there and sew the seam. Okay, so let's take a look at how this worked. So at this end, yep, I can see that my stitching line is, there's still a little bit of some of that background triangle sticking out there, so I know that's good. And on this end, my stitching line went right through that V. We press our seam towards the C1, and when we look at that edge, first thing that we see is that those two patches are aligned, and if we hold our ruler up to check, then we can see that the tip of our green, our D square, is at the 1/4 inch or even slightly in beyond the 1/4 inch, so we know we won't lose the tip of our square when we sew our unit to our block. All right, so we've got that piece. Now we're going to add another DE3 unit. So I'll flip it down here. I've got this seam going this way, so I'll sew with this one on top. And at this top end of the strip, I've got angle meets angle, so that's 1/4 of an inch from the edge. At the bottom, I've got square meets angle, and I know that that's 3/8 of an inch. So let's give that a try. Slide it in. Now this one, it's almost a little bit less than what I want, so I'm gonna just scooch it up and hold it there. And let's see how it turns out. Oh, I like where it just crossed. You can see that there's a little bit of my C1 here beyond the stitching line, and at this end I think I'm gonna like where that's crossing there. We're gonna press our seam towards C1. To do is add our other C2 unit. I flip that over. My seam is going down if I put C2 on top. Again, I've got 2 triangle tips, so I'm going to match those triangle tips. And at the bottom end, I've got angle meets angle, so they're going to match. They're going to line up 1/4 inch from the right edge. So let's sew this seam. And here we go. And if it looks like they're going to be something other than 1/4 inch, you just either push it up or push it down so that they are 1/4 inch. And keep those right edges aligned. And let's see how it looks. Okay, on this edge, I think it was 1/4 inch. And I'm going to press my seam toward C2. And these two have lined up pretty much bang on, And take my ruler out here. When I put my ruler right on that edge, my D square is right on the 1/4 inch line. So there's the unit, and I'm pretty happy with that. Zoom out. There we go. There is our first unit that is sewn. And so the reason why everything lined up at that top edge is because every time we had angle meets angle, they met on the 1/4 inch seam line. And I think they did on every seam there. And every time we had angle meets square, as it did down when we added the first D unit, they're going to line up 3/8 from the edge. So there is our unit. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. You'll find the button down there on the right. You can also find me at pattysPatchwork.com, where you'll find all my patterns, on Facebook at Patty's Patchwork, and on Instagram at Patty's Patchwork. Thanks for stopping by. We'll see you next time.